Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. Spring is normally a time of emergence and inspiration. But many scholars, artists, and organizers right now are struggling after a year spent inside in a pandemic that is still far from over. My guest today on the show is Kānaka Maoli food studies scholar Hiʻilei Julia Kawehipuaakahaopulani Hobart. Hiʻilei's approach to scholarly and activist inspiration brings the rich histories and futures of Indigenous community building to bear on daily practices of writing and living during the pandemic. In our interview, Hiʻilei and I chat about using scholarly research to do justice to ancestors and communities, the future of Indigenous food sovereignty activism, and why connecting individual healing practices like gardening to collective movements for decolonization is key to how Hiʻilei imagines otherwise. Thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
March is a time when those first beginnings of spring start poking up, and I know a lot of us are getting re-inspired by our projects and our work, particularly as we emerge from a pretty rough winter season, especially in terms of the pandemic and a lot of pretty devastating recent events. I'm curious, how is inspiration showing up for you these days?
That's a great question, and it's one that I spent quite a bit of time grappling with internally, because this March feels like a very different spring than any that I can think of before. Yes, this March is the moment when things are coming back into bloom and, new plants are growing, and that's very exciting. But simultaneously, this March, marks a year into this pandemic for a lot of us. And so it carries a kind of heaviness for me that doesn't usually come. So as far as inspiration goes, this is after a year spent inside and a year with varying degrees of non-existent childcare and starting on the tenure track. My inspiration well has been pretty dry for a long time.
You're definitely not alone in that case, for sure.
With all of the gratitude that I have for the ways that we have been privileged enough to weather this pandemic by working from home, inspiration's been difficult to come by with the, profound amount of domestic labor and intellectual labor and emotional labor that comes with carrying on in the midst of, a world that has felt like it is falling apart and has always been fallen apart. So some of the tiny things that I've been doing at home is I've been growing a vegetable garden with my 3-year-old daughter. And there's something about that feels very grounding. It is an incredibly modest garden, but we go out to it every day and we check our ripening tomatoes and we check our ripening strawberries. And it really just helps to serve as a tiny reminder that even in really heavy, awful times, things can still grow. You can still make things grow and help coax life along.
I know one of the things that you have growing right now is this really amazing book manuscript that you're making progress on and delving into. I'm wondering if we can turn to that, because I think in many ways it's a good example of how scholars are approaching the professional demands of publish or perish, keep writing when the world is on fire. But I think you're approaching it in a really interesting way. So first of all, for folks who aren't familiar with that book, it's called Cooling the Tropics, Ice, Indigeneity, and Hawaiian Refreshment. What is that book all about?
So the book takes a long view on the development of the political and social history of the cold in Hawaii. It starts in pre-colonial Hawaii, highlighting Native Hawaiian or Kānaka Maoli understandings of the cold, particularly as it's related to our akua, our deities that anchor our spiritual worlds at the summits of our tall mountains. Water will regularly freeze throughout the year. And think about that beginning to understand how ice has gone from this really profound and celestial element of our spiritual worlds into this incredibly mundane and ambient infrastructure of daily life in Hawaii. Comestible ice first arrives in Hawaii in 1850, coming off of ships from the American Northeast that had sailed all the way around Cape Horn and across the Pacific. This ice that arrived in 1850 was quickly broken off, chipped into pieces, and put into cocktails. I always find that detail incredibly arresting because of the sheer amount of effort that went into handing somebody a cold drink. For me, this sets into motion this history that I'm tracing about refreshment and comfort and leisure in the tropics and the ways that it becomes intimately connected to empire and whiteness. So from 1850, when these first blocks arrive, we start to see the emergence of cocktails and ice creams and discourses that connect this to projects of assimilation and civility that are imposed on Kānaka Maoli and the various immigrant groups that are coming in to provide labor for the sugarcane plantations and the various plantations that came to follow. The book eventually ends up at shave ice, this kind of paradigmatic refreshment that becomes interpolated as distinctly Hawaiian, but is anything but. And to think about the ways that native dispossession in Hawaii kind of resolves in the 1970s and 1980s in Hawaii, liberal state multiculturalism, through this image of an edible rainbow and the ways that that gets mapped onto race relations in Hawaii as purportedly being this harmonious resolution to American occupation. So that's the arc of the book. One of the things that I try to highlight in it is the ways that we take for granted the cold as this ambient element of our lives that has actually been carefully and painstakingly developed over a long period of time, and that today requires a huge amount of energy and infrastructural investment to keep Hawaii going. The implications of this work, I think, help us to understand in part Hawaii's over-reliance on importation for its food system. People that are interested in food in Hawaii will very often remark that 85 to 90% of Hawaii's food is imported, despite having a near year-round growing season and these histories of profound abundance. One of the things that I realize over the course of this work is that part of Hawaii's overdependence on imported foods is not only through these dispossessive logics and plantation economies, but also the over-reliance on energy infrastructure in order to keep this all going. So essentially, the book takes a look at the development of the cold chain and the way that the cold chain has really shaped the way that we eat, the way that we refresh ourselves, the ways that we articulate comfort in the world that is premised on these histories of empire.
What got you inspired to approach the history of Native Hawaiian dispossession through the lens of ice and food?
As a doctoral student, I had already started my PhD program before turning to this project and was about halfway through my coursework and had entered into a food studies program in order to think about the intersections of food and media. I was coming out of a background in library science and archives management. My proposed project had absolutely nothing to do with settler colonialism, Indigenous studies, or Hawaii. Being a Kānaka Maoli who was born and raised in Hawaii, I think there was something in me that was always kind of leery about touching something that was so close to home. I think that I had gone through higher education, not having anybody pull me aside yet and say, P.S., if you do a project that has really significant stakes for you, it can be this really exciting space to work in. When you're starting your dissertation and moving it into a book project that spans about a decade of one's life, there has to be something in there that carries you through, that sustains you. For me, personal stakes have been the thing that sustains me. But nobody had ever mentioned this to me, or it never occurred to me. So I was doing this food and media project in my program. And for a number of personal reasons, I kind of hit pause. My parents had passed away not very long before, and I had turned to the process of packing up and selling my family home in Hawaii. So there was something in that time period of my personal life that was a little bit unmooring. In the summers between my first and second year of coursework, I thought, you know what? All of these things that I was expecting my parents to just pass down to me or hand down to me isn't going to happen. And the only way that I'm going to get a firm grasp on really understanding the place that I'm from and the place that I identify with is through self-education. So at the beginning of that summer, I just checked out a stack of books that were like, the 15 most important texts on Hawaiian political history. And I just was like, this summer, I'm going to read this stack beginning to end all the way through. At the end of that summer, I convinced Audra Simpson, a Mohawk scholar at Columbia University, to let me into her settler colonialism in North America course. I thought I'll just take this course as a gift to myself. And in this class, I can work out some of these questions and ideas that had come up for me that summer. I wrote this term paper for her. And that term paper, by the time I finished it, became the first piece of the book. I reached out to my advisors. I said, hey, you know what? The thing that I said I was going to do when I got here, I'm not going to do it. I need to do this project. This is the project that's calling me. So that's the thing that turned into the book. The first piece of the book that I really started looking at were the trade agreements that the United States made with Hawaii, predominantly to facilitate the trade of sugar. But in those trade agreements were schedules of all kinds of consumer goods and a lot of food items, which is how I first started looking at it. And within those items was ice. So this was 1875 that the first agreement was made. And I thought, well, how curious. I was curious about the technological infrastructures for the trade of ice across vast distances. I was curious about why the US would want to protect a trade interest in ice to Hawaii. So I just started pulling on that thread. And as I pulled on that thread, I started realizing that ice, even though it was this really minor trade commodity between Hawaii and the US, signaled all kinds of ideas about empire, colonialism, race, refreshment, and the food system. So that's how I got started on this book.
I think that's such a great story of the windy paths that we all take into the projects that we deeply care about. I think there's often a myth that it's somehow linear, that we decide from the outset, I shall produce a project about X. I have a complete understanding of what that is, and I will follow that through in this linear teleological fashion. As this shows, as the actual story behind the scholarship shows, that's not how it works at all. I think your metaphor, pulling on the thread, is a really great description of the much more complex way that we get into the stuff that we care about.
Yes, it feels scary to change tack sometimes. As scholars, the lesson that we all variously learn is what to let go of and what to keep. It's a significant amount of labor to do this kind of work. And sometimes we drop things in order to take up what we're being called towards. I have gratitude to my past self for taking a really big chance in changing my direction midstream.
So if that's the story of what got you inspired to start the project, I'd love to hear how that inspiration has shifted over the course of the project, over that 10-year span that you're talking about. I think inspiration and motivation and staying invested in the project, even when you're sometimes sick of it, particularly first book projects, which, as you've pointed out, you work on for a long, long time at different stages of your career. What do you do to stay inspired and invested in the actual writing process itself when you're working on this long-term book writing project?
It has really come down to remembering who I'm doing this project for. When you talk to Indigenous studies scholars, you'll probably hear this frequently, that you are obligated to your community to do justice to these histories. These are histories that have been poorly written or misinterpreted by generations of non-Indigenous scholars. So as a Native Hawaiian scholar, I'm constantly reminded that there's a community at home that's going to read this work, and I have to get it right. I'm obligated to get it right, or to do the best that I can to interpret the historical sources with care and nuance and belief in my people. There's folks at home that will read this book and will think about this book and have conversations with me about it. I'm not disassociated or unattached to these communities. So there's a social aspect to this kind of work that feels very present. And then you're also doing this work for your ancestors, thinking about these historical wrongs of occupation and dispossession that have happened in your home communities. That's pretty good motivation
Indeed.
to keep going.
Indigenous food sovereignty is something that I've talked with several guests on the show about over the years. You've written quite a lot about this as well, both in this book, but in some of your previous scholarship too. I'm curious where you see the future of Indigenous food sovereignty movements or activism going. How do you see climate change or current political events or future political events for that matter motivate and inspire activist struggles around Indigenous food sovereignty?
That's a really complex question that I think is really useful for thinking about Indigenous food sovereignty. We tend to think about Indigenous food sovereignty as being about free access to culturally appropriate foods or the health implications of a colonized diet. But a lot of folks also understand that this has a lot to do with land dispossession across a deep history. One of the things that I really appreciate about the conversation around Indigenous food sovereignty is actually how large it is. It interrogates our interpersonal relationships with food, the way that we talk about food or think about food with our kin around the table, but also our relationships with the world around us, the environment, plants and animals. It also signals political histories. And so it interrogates private property regimes and resource extraction. So it's one anchor for talking about a host of problems. The way that I see the future of this conversation going is folks really understanding different communities as being in interrelated struggles. These struggles that Indigenous communities are having all around the world, whether it's about access to food or about climate change. These are really connected through histories of empire and resource extraction, removal, and dispossession. Increasingly, I think we're getting the language for articulating the connections between distinct struggles.
So this brings me to my absolute favorite question that I like to close out every interview with, and that's that version of a better world that you're working towards when you do this kind of work. That vision that inspires you, that keeps you motivated, that you build collectively with others in your community and beyond. So I'll ask you this giant question that I think is also a really important question. What's the world that you're working toward? What kind of world do you want?
I have spent some time thinking about this question. It's a question that I am excited to be asked, and it's a question that I'm a little bit nervous to be answering because I think it's a really big question and a challenging question. There are lots of things that I would like to see in a world. I'd like to see a deoccupied Pacific. I'd like to see the dismantling of white supremacy. I'd like to see a world in which our food systems can be self-determined. I like the approach to thinking of otherwise worlds as a world in which many worlds can fit. We don't all need to necessarily want the same thing. This helps remind me that our struggles, even if they are related, are also distinct. Communities of color and Indigenous communities in particular were incredibly varied. We have really specific histories that inform the visions that we have of the future. For Hawaii in particular, given my work and my project and my background in food studies, what I would really like to see is Hawaii be able to return to what Candice Fujikane really productively calls economies of abundance. Her new book, Mapping Abundance, it's really lovely. One of the things that she marks or highlights in that work is to turn towards economies of abundance and away from capitalist economies of scarcity. I think that's a really beautiful phrasing. How can we get at the issues of capitalism and how can we start to undo capitalism? She says, if we strike capitalism at its heart, we strike it at the way that it perpetuates scarcity. Instead, we can turn to abundance and use that to our advantage. I realize I'm highlighting Candice's work in order to answer this question. But for me, that's incredibly generative in thinking about what an otherwise world might be.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all of the amazing ways that you imagine otherwise.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by me, Cathy Hannabach. You can check out the show notes for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guest, as well as find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.